Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the Table of Nations in Genesis chapter 10 in our continuing study of the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 9, the last few verses of that chapter, we see a prophecy that Noah gives that really concern the nations, his sons. In chapter 10, it's the fulfillment of that prophecy through the listing of the various nations. And then in chapter 11, we find how that took place in chapter 10. Now, we're not going to cover chapter 11 in this session, but we're going to see there the division of the nations. In chapter 9, there was that curse upon Canaan. In chapter 10, we read of one of the descendants of Canaan. Well, actually, it's not Canaan. It's one of the descendants of Ham, so a distant cousin of Canaan, I suppose. The career of Nimrod is specified. And then in chapter 11, how that takes place, or what comes as a result of that, the judgment of the languages at Babel, and there we'll read of the Tower of Babel. Genesis chapter 10, verse 1, now these are the records of the generations. Now we've seen that phrase before. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth. These are the generations of Adam. These are the generations of Noah. And now these are the records of the generations of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the sons of Noah. And the sons were born to them after the flood, and that's what we're going to read about here in chapter 10. Now, I'm not going to read every single verse. We'd be reading a lot of begats. We're not going to do that. But let's look at those names, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. We're going to see the descendants of Shem largely in the Middle East. As for the descendants of Ham, although they won't all start out this way, we'll see most of them centered around the area of Africa, although some will be in the Middle East as well. And the descendants of Japheth are largely going to be moving to the northwest up into Asia and Europe. Now, notice the order we went in. We went Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and now Genesis chapter 10 goes on to tell us what happened to those in the opposite order. So next we look at Japheth, and we look to see what happens with his descendants. In the case of Japheth, we said they're going to mostly be in Europe. We are told of Gomer. According to tradition, these become Germanic peoples. Magog are the peoples to the north of the Black Sea, and we know of them in history as the Scythians. Madai is, you can almost hear the word there, the Medes. Remember how later on we're going to have the people, the Medes and the Persians. Javan is just the Hebrew designation for those who live in among the Greeks. Tubal and Meshech are tribes, according to Josephus, that live around the Black Sea. And Tiras, probably a term for the peoples that live near, up in the, I guess we'd call it Thrace today. Next we have Ham, and the descendants of Ham are going to be Cush. That's the reference to the people living south of Egypt. You go down the Nile River to the southern parts of the Nile, and you find the people of Cush there. Mitzrayim is the Hebrew designation for Egypt, and notice that it's plural. We also have the land of Put, that's to the west of Egypt, the land of Libya. And Canaan, of course, we've already been introduced to Canaan in the previous chapter, and we're going to see a lot about the land of Canaan. That will be the people who live in Israel, what becomes Israel. Genesis chapter 10, verse 8. Now Cush, and for the first time we have this periscope that deals at length with one of those people groups. Now Cush became the father of Nimrod. He became a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. Now, that designation can mean he's a mighty hunter in service of God, submissive to God, but that doesn't appear to be the case. Instead, he seems to be a mighty hunter before the Lord in that he's rebellious against God. He's doing his own thing. He's maybe sort of a mighty one that's setting up something that's antagonistic to God. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and we're going to read more about Babylon, or Babel, in chapter 11. Remember, when we see the word Babel, or later on in the Old Testament we'll see Babylon, it's exactly the same Hebrew designation. For some reason, the translators have chosen to render one Babel and the other Babylon, but it's the same Hebrew word. So the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. From that land he went forth into Assyria, and built Nineveh, and Rehoboth, Ir, and Calah, and Rezin, between Nineveh and Calah. That is the great city. So all of these places that Nimrod goes, we start off with Babel or Babylon. That's in central Mesopotamia. Erech we know of as the city of Erech, and Akkad, the Akkadians. We have Calneh, and we have Nineveh. Next we move to Shem. Now that's going to be the Semitic line, and so from Shem we have Elam. The Elamites live to the east of Mesopotamia. Asher is what we call the people from Assyria. Now there's a difference between Syria versus Assyria. Asher is Assyria. The Assyrians were their capital at Nineveh. Lud, the Lydians lived in southern Anatolia, or what we call modern-day Turkey. Aram are very familiar to us because their capital is at Damascus. Remember, we have a language that follows all the way into the New Testament known as Aramaic, and the Jewish people are going to start with an alphabet very early, but by about 800 BC, they're going to switch the way they do their letters to the Aramaic way. And so when you read Hebrew, you're actually utilizing the Aramaic alphabet. Genesis chapter 10, verse 25 tells us that two sons were born to Eber. That Eber is a reference to that line that's following that line of Shem, and this seems to be the source of the term Hebrew. So two sons were born to Eber. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was pelegged. It was divided. And that seems to be, a very significant thing, and his brother's name was Joktan. And so the question comes, what does it mean to say the earth was divided? And that's probably a reference to what we're going to see in the next chapter with the division of the languages, the Tower of Babel, where we're going to have people go in different directions, and there'll be the scattering of those nations due to the confusion of languages. So we have the conclusion, chapter 10, verse 32. These are the families of the sons of Noah, according to their genealogies, by their nations, and out of these the nations were separated on the earth after the flood. So we have these that are mentioned. Now, if we do not count the three sons of Noah, there are a total of 70 names in this table. And 7 is a very significant number. Of course, 70 is just the multiple of 10, and 10 is significant too in the Pentateuch. So it's 70 names in this table. What's significant about that number 70? We're going to see in Genesis chapter 46, verse 27, that all of the persons of the house of Jacob who came to Egypt, when the Israelites moved down into Egypt, there are going to be 70 of them. And it's significant that the number of nations that are mentioned here and the number of Israelites who go down into Egypt are exactly the same number. Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 7 through 9. Moses is going to lead the people. Actually, he's not going to go into the promised land, but he's giving sort of a rehashing of the history of the people of the promised land. And he says, when the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, going back to Genesis chapter 10, when he separated the sons of man, we saw that was a phrase that was used, he set the boundaries of the people according to the number of the sons of Israel, where the number of nations and the number of the sons of Israel was the same number. And here's why, verse 9, for the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob is the allotment of his inheritance. so that Israel becomes a microcosm of the world. Israel is the representative for the entire world. And when we come to the New Testament, we find that Jesus comes as the better Israel who came to save the world. That he is not just the representative of Israel, but he came to represent all men as he died upon the cross, dying in our place, dying for our sin, that he might save all who turn to him.